June 1944, Saipan. Lieutenant Colonel James Hoffman stood on the ridge overlooking the valley where Japanese imperial forces had made their last desperate stand. The acrid smell of cordite still hung in the air as American artillery crews continued loading and firing in the distance. Through his binoculars, he watched as a captured Japanese officer was led toward the command post. Even from this distance, Hoffman could read the man's face. Confusion mingled with disbelief. Later, the interpreter would translate what many prisoners had been saying for weeks. How can they keep firing without stopping? Where do all these shells come from? It's impossible. The impossibility was America's industrial might, a force more devastating than any weapon. The artillery barrage that had just concluded represented more shells fired in a single hour than some Japanese units had available for an entire month-long campaign. The mathematics were becoming clear to both sides. This was no longer a war of courage or tactics. This was a war of production capacity, and America's capacity appeared limitless. In the command tent, as Hoffman reviewed the after-action reports, he made a decision that would alter the mathematics of the Pacific War. These lessons in logistics and industrial capacity needed to be documented, analyzed, and understood. The secret to America's artillery dominance wasn't in the guns themselves, it was in the revolution that had occurred thousands of miles away on American soil. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The artillery revolution began in late 1941, when the United States entered World War II with the profound disadvantage in military equipment and trained personnel. The U.S. Army possessed fewer than 500,000 men under arms and lacked modern artillery, tanks, and aircraft in sufficient numbers to challenge Axis powers. American industry was still transitioning from civilian to military production, and the artillery shell stockpiles were dangerously low by global war standards. Major General Leslie McNair, Chief of Army Ground Forces, recognized this weakness immediately. In January 1942, he commissioned a comprehensive analysis of America's artillery production capacity. The report was sobering. At current production levels, American forces would be outgunned on every front. German and Japanese artillery doctrine had been refined through years of combat, while American gunners were still training with outdated tactics and insufficient ammunition allowances. The numbers told a grim story. The standard German division could deploy approximately 48 artillery pieces supported by a well-established ammunition supply chain. The Japanese had fewer guns per division but had optimized their use in jungle terrain. American divisions, by contrast, had artillery on paper but lacked the shells needed to sustain combat operations at the intensity being reported from Europe and the Pacific. In February 1942, McNair convened a special conference at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Artillery officers, industrialists, and logistics experts gathered to address what was becoming known as the shell problem. Among the attendees was Dr. William Schuyler, a civilian metallurgist with no military background but with exceptional insights into mass production techniques.
The conventional approach to artillery shell manufacturing involved complex machining operations that required skilled labor and specialized equipment. Each shell needed precise dimensions to ensure accurate flight and consistent detonation. The process was time-consuming and relied on experienced machinists, a resource already stretched thin by other war production needs. During the conference lunch break, Schuyler found himself seated beside Colonel Thomas Baldwin, an artillery officer who had observed Japanese operations in China before America entered the war. Baldwin described the Japanese approach to artillery: carefully hoarded shells, precisely targeted fire missions, and strict conservation of ammunition. "They count every round," Baldwin explained. "Their entire doctrine is built around scarcity." This conversation sparked an insight for Schuyler. The American approach couldn't mirror the Japanese or German models. America needed to play to its strengths: abundant raw materials, massive industrial capacity, and the ability to standardize and simplify complex manufacturing processes. The solution wasn't to adapt to ammunition scarcity, but to eliminate scarcity altogether. After the conference, Schuyler drafted a proposal titled Shell Production Modernization Initiative. The document outlined a radical reinvention of artillery shell manufacturing using principles borrowed from automotive assembly lines. The key innovation was a shift from traditional machining to stamping, pressing, and casting operations that could be performed by semi-skilled workers using automated equipment. When Schuyler presented his plan to the Army Ordnance Department in March 1942, the initial response was skepticism. Military procurement officers pointed out the technical challenges in adapting mass production techniques to precision munitions. There were concerns about quality control, reliability, and whether simplified production methods could maintain the tolerances needed for modern artillery. Schuyler persisted, arguing that perfect shells weren't the objective, sufficient shells were. He proposed a modified quality standard that prioritized reliable functionality over machining perfection. A shell that's 95% as accurate but can be produced in 5 times the quantity will win this war, he insisted. The mathematics are undeniable. The breakthrough came when Henry Kaiser, the industrialist famous for revolutionizing shipbuilding speed, reviewed Schuyler's proposal. Kaiser immediately recognized the parallels to his own approach in the Liberty ship program. "This man is right," Kaiser told the Ordnance Department. "We don't need artisanal shells, we need rivers of functional shells." With Kaiser's influential backing, the Shell Production Modernization Initiative gained momentum. In April 1942, the War Production Board authorized a pilot program to test Schuyler's methods at 3 existing factories. The initial results exceeded even Schuyler's optimistic projections. Production rates doubled within weeks as new processes eliminated bottlenecks and reduced machining time. The most significant innovation came in the casting of shell bodies. Traditional methods required extensive machining to achieve the aerodynamic profile and precise dimensions. Schuyler's team developed a precision casting technique using permanent metal molds that produced near-final dimensions, drastically reducing machining requirements. The walls of the shells could be thinner yet stronger thanks to advances in metallurgical science. Fuse production, another critical bottleneck, was similarly revolutionized. The delicate timing mechanisms that cause shells to detonate at the right moment had been assembled largely by hand. Schuyler's team redesigned the fuses with fewer moving parts and introduced semi-automated assembly processes borrowed from the watch industry.
Operations around the assumption of overwhelming fire support whenever and wherever needed. The transformation reached its peak in early 1944 as the United States prepared for the invasion of Normandy and accelerated its Pacific campaign. Artillery shell production had reached the staggering figure of 5 million rounds per month, more than all other Allied nations combined. American factories were now producing every 3 days what had been a month's output in early 1942. This abundance created a fundamental asymmetry in combat power. German and Japanese forces, increasingly constrained by bombing campaigns against their industrial centers, found themselves rationing artillery shells with ever greater stringency. American forces, by contrast, operated with no meaningful constraints on ammunition expenditure. The psychological impact on enemy forces was becoming evident by mid-1944. Japanese defense preparations on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam showed increasing emphasis on protection against artillery bombardment. Captured documents revealed that Japanese commanders considered American artillery the most significant threat, more feared than air power or naval gunfire, precisely because of its relentlessness. One Japanese officer's diary, recovered on Saipan, contained a passage that summarized the psychological effect. "The American guns never sleep. Even when they are not aiming at specific targets, they fire throughout the night. Their supply of shells must be infinite. Our men cannot rest, cannot eat, cannot even think clearly under this constant thunder. It is as though we face not an army, but a force of nature. The unrelenting pressure took a measurable toll on Japanese combat effectiveness. Medical officers examining prisoners and casualties found increasing rates of combat stress reactions directly attributable to artillery exposure. Sleep deprivation and the constant threat of random death eroded unit cohesion and fighting spirit. For American artillery units, the transformation was equally profound, but in the opposite direction. Gunners who had trained under ammunition conservation doctrines now operated in an environment of deliberate excess. Battery commanders received allocations that would have seemed fantastic to their pre-war selves. The constraint was no longer shell supply, but the physical limitations of the guns themselves. The rate of fire that could be sustained by artillery crews became the new limiting factor. Guns would overheat or their barrels wear out before ammunition supplies ran low. This led to further innovations in gun design and crew procedures. Water cooling systems, barrel replacement protocols, and rotation schemes for gun crews were developed to maintain the highest possible sustained rate of fire. Colonel Alexander Green, commanding an artillery group supporting the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu, instituted a revolutionary firing schedule. Rather than concentrating all guns on a single target area, he maintained a continuous barrage across the entire Japanese line, with guns firing in carefully orchestrated sequence. "We never allow a sector to fall silent," he explained in a report. "The psychological effect of knowing shells will fall in your area every few minutes without pause, day and night, is as important as the physical destruction." The abundance of artillery shells also allowed for specialized ammunition types that would have been impractical under conditions of scarcity. Smoke, illumination, and proximity-fused shells could be employed lavishly without concerns about depleting stocks of high-explosive rounds. This tactical flexibility further magnified the effective combat power of American artillery units. When Allied forces pushed into Germany in early 1945, captured German officers expressed astonishment at American artillery practices. General Gunther Blumentritt remarked during interrogation, "We could never understand the seeming waste of shells. You fired thousands of rounds to suppress positions that we would have used a few dozen shells to engage. But we came to fear this American method more than precision firing because it gave us no respite." But perhaps the most profound testament to America's shell production miracle came from a former Japanese artillery commander captured on Okinawa. When asked about the most significant difference between Japanese and American artillery, he replied simply, "You fire more shells in 1 hour than I was allocated for an entire campaign. Against such abundance, there can be only one outcome." The transformation of American artillery doctrine occurred with remarkable speed. Before Pearl Harbor, U.S. Army field manuals emphasized precision fire and ammunition conservation. By mid-1943, these same manuals had been hastily revised to incorporate what was being called the Doctrine of Abundance. The revised field manual, FM 6-20, Field Artillery Tactics and Techniques, issued in July 1943, explicitly stated, "Artillery ammunition is to be considered an offensive weapon in itself, not merely a limited resource to be carefully husbanded." This philosophical shift represented more than just a tactical adaptation. It signaled the fundamental reconceptualization of industrial capacity as a direct combat multiplier. America's factories had become as important to victory as its fighting forces. The production lines in Pittsburgh, Detroit, and 100 smaller manufacturing centers were, in a very real sense, extensions of the front lines. The story of this transformation reached Japanese military leadership through intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and direct battlefield experience. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who would later command Japanese forces in the Philippines, wrote an assessment in August 1943 that proved remarkably prescient. The American strategy appears to be substituting industrial output for tactical sophistication. They have chosen to solve military problems through sheer material abundance rather than finesse. This approach, while seemingly wasteful, may prove effective against our forces if we cannot match their production capacity. Yamashita's analysis was correct, but his warning went largely unheeded. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual factors over material ones. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese fighting spirit, was believed to be superior to mere industrial might. This cultural bias prevented many Japanese commanders from recognizing the existential threat posed by America's production advantage until it was too late. In Washington, the implications of the shell production miracle were being carefully studied. The Joint Chiefs of Staff received monthly reports tracking the widening gap between American and Axis ammunition supplies. These reports informed strategic decisions about offensive operations and resource allocation. By late 1943, the abundance of artillery ammunition had become a key factor in operational planning throughout both European and Pacific theaters. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, recognized the broader implications. In a November 1943 memo to the War Production Board, he wrote, "The shell production program has demonstrated that American industry, when properly organized and directed, can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. This lesson must be applied to all categories of war materiel." The artillery shell model became a template for other production programs, from aircraft to radios to medical supplies. The human dimension of this production miracle was equally remarkable. The workforce that made it possible was predominantly female, women who had never before worked in factories. At the peak of war production, women constituted over 65% of the workforce in munitions plants. These arsenal women, as they came to be called, transformed American manufacturing while simultaneously transforming social expectations about women's capabilities. Dorothy Kingsley had been a schoolteacher in Minneapolis before the war. In May 1942, she joined the workforce at the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant. Within 6 months, she had become a shift supervisor overseeing shell casing production. "We knew every shell might save an American life," she recalled in a 1946 interview. "That knowledge changed how we thought about factory work. This wasn't just a job, it was our contribution to victory." The production lines operated around the clock, 7 days a week. Shift changes were carefully choreographed to ensure that production never stopped. New workers received accelerated training, often learning their tasks directly on the line under the supervision of more experienced workers. This apprenticeship system, another innovation borrowed from the automotive industry, allowed rapid workforce expansion without sacrificing quality or output. Safety remained a persistent challenge. The volatile materials used in shell production created inherent dangers. Despite improved safety protocols, accidents occurred. The worst came in September 1943 at the Elwood Ordnance Plant in Illinois, where an explosion killed 49 workers, most of them women. Yet production barely paused. The very next day, workers at other plants voluntarily worked extra shifts to make up for the lost output. This dedication reflected a deeper understanding among the workforce that their efforts directly impacted the front lines. Factory bulletin boards displayed letters from artillery units describing how the shells were being used and their effect on enemy forces. Bond rallies at the plants often featured combat veterans who spoke about the importance of ammunition supply. These connections fostered a sense of purpose that transcended normal industrial relationships. Innovation continued throughout the production process. Engineers at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia developed a new rotating band design that reduced copper usage by 30% per shell without affecting accuracy. This seemingly minor change saved thousands of tons of copper annually, a critical material also needed for electrical equipment. Similar incremental improvements occurred across every aspect of shell production, each contributing to greater efficiency and output. Quality control evolved into a sophisticated science. Statistical sampling methods, pioneered by Bell Laboratories before the war, were adapted to shell production. Rather than inspecting every shell, an impossible task given the volume, carefully selected samples underwent rigorous testing. The results allowed engineers to identify and correct emerging problems before they affected significant quantities of ammunition. The scale of the enterprise grew beyond anything previously imagined. By mid-1944, the United States had constructed 73 specialized facilities dedicated to various aspects of artillery ammunition production. These ranged from massive integrated plants like the St. Louis Ordnance Plant, which produced complete shells, to specialized facilities that manufactured only fuses, propellant, or explosive fillers. Logistics systems evolved to handle this unprecedented volume. New storage facilities were constructed near ports on both coasts. Specialized ammunition ships with compartmentalized holds allowed safer transport across submarine-infested waters. Hardened ammunition dumps were established in England, Australia, and other forward areas to maintain supply flow to the front lines. The Japanese High Command gradually came to understand the significance of America's production advantage, but too late to develop effective countermeasures. Admiral Irasoku Yamamoto, who had lived in the United States before the war, had famously warned that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial might. His assassination in April 1943 removed one of the few senior Japanese leaders who truly comprehended the challenge. By early 1944, Japan faced an increasingly dire strategic situation. Its own industrial base, never comparable to America's, was under mounting pressure from submarine blockade and strategic bombing. Shell production in Japan peaked in late 1943 and then began a steady decline. Japanese artillery units in the field were receiving ever smaller ammunition allocations at precisely the time American units were seeing their already generous allowances increased. This disparity became starkly evident during the Mariana Islands campaign in June and July 1944. American forces landing on Saipan brought with them an unprecedented concentration of artillery, over 300 guns supporting a single corps-sized operation. More significantly, they brought sufficient ammunition to maintain continuous fire support throughout the three-week campaign. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the Expeditionary Forces, established a new artillery doctrine specifically for the Pacific Island campaigns. Designated Progressive Concentrated Fire, the approach divided each island into grid zones that would receive sequential saturation bombardment. As infantry advanced into one zone, artillery would shift to the next, maintaining constant pressure on Japanese positions. This method required enormous ammunition expenditure, typically 20,000 to 50,000 shells per day during active operations. Such consumption would have been unthinkable before the production revolution. Now it was standard procedure. Artillery officers no longer submitted ammunition requests based on specific targets, but instead received standard daily allocations regardless of identified firing missions. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was devastating. Captain Sakae Oba, who commanded one of the last organized Japanese units on Saipan, wrote in his diary, "The American artillery is inhuman. It does not target our positions specifically. It simply covers entire areas with explosive force. We cannot move, cannot resupply, cannot even bury our dead. The shells fall day and night without pattern or pause. They seem to have no concern for how many they use." American infantry quickly recognized the advantage this fire support provided.
Sergeant Frank Tucker with the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan recalled, "The Japanese were good soldiers, brave, determined, and skilled at concealment. But they couldn't withstand our artillery. It wasn't just the physical damage, though that was bad enough. It was the knowledge that whenever they gathered in strength, whenever they tried to counterattack or reinforce a position, our artillery would hammer them without mercy or limit." The revolution expanded beyond traditional tube artillery. By 1944, American forces deployed increasing numbers of rocket artillery systems, particularly the truck-mounted M8 and T-44 systems that could saturate an area with 4.5-inch rockets. These systems, less accurate than conventional artillery, but capable of delivering massive firepower quickly, perfectly complemented the doctrine of abundance. Major General Joseph Swing, an artillery officer by training, oversaw the integration of rocket systems into the American arsenal. In a September 1944 report, he noted, "The psychological effect of rocket artillery cannot be overstated. The distinctive sound, what the troops call the screaming memes,
combined with the almost instantaneous impact of dozens of warheads, creates panic among enemy forces unfamiliar with these weapons. When used in conjunction with conventional artillery, the effect is often decisive." As American forces pushed westward across the Pacific, Japanese defensive tactics evolved in response to artillery dominance. Unable to match American firepower, Japanese commanders increasingly relied on deeply buried fortifications and dispersed small-unit positions. These adaptations made their defenses more resilient against bombardment, but reduced their offensive capabilities and made coordinated resistance more difficult. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Japanese forces on Okinawa in 1945, explicitly designed his defensive plan around the assumption of overwhelming American artillery superiority. His directive to subordinate commanders stated, "We cannot match American firepower. Therefore, we must negate its effectiveness through dispersion, concealment, and the construction of positions that can withstand even their heaviest bombardments. We must accept that surface movement in daylight will be virtually impossible once their artillery is registered." Ushijima's assessment proved accurate but insufficient. Despite elaborate preparations, Japanese forces on Okinawa suffered devastating casualties from American artillery. The battle saw the highest sustained rate of artillery fire in the Pacific War, with American guns firing over 2 million shells during the 82-day campaign. On peak days, more than 30,000 rounds struck Japanese positions. The Okinawa campaign also demonstrated how artillery abundance had changed tactical relationships between artillery and infantry. In previous wars, infantry advanced to secure terrain from which artillery could then support further advances. In the mature American system of 1945, this relationship was often reversed. Artillery preparing sectors so thoroughly that infantry could occupy them with minimal resistance, establishing new positions from which artillery could repeat the process. Colonel Joseph Whitehorn, an artillery group commander on Okinawa, described this evolution. "We no longer think in terms of infantry objectives supported by artillery. We now identify artillery preparation zones followed by infantry occupation. This subtle distinction represents a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize combined arms operations. It has been made possible entirely by our unlimited ammunition supply." The artillery revolution shaped Japanese perceptions of Americans in ways that extended beyond the battlefield. The ability to expend seemingly unlimited resources on destruction contradicted Japanese cultural values of efficiency and conservation. Lieutenant Tadashi Nakajima, captured on Iwo Jima, expressed this disconnect during interrogation. "We were taught that Americans were soft and decadent, unable to endure hardship. Yet you throw away more steel in a day than we might use in a month. There is something terrible in this willingness to expend resources so freely." For American forces, the psychological benefit worked in the opposite direction. artillery crews and the infantry they supported developed a sense of material superiority that bolstered confidence even in the face of fanatical Japanese resistance. This confidence was particularly valuable for replacement troops entering combat for the first time, knowing they had overwhelming fire support available whenever needed. The revolution extended to inter-service cooperation as well. By 1944, coordination between Army artillery, naval gunfire, and air support had reached unprecedented levels of integration. Fire support coordination centers brought together representatives from all
services to ensure continuous bombardment of enemy positions regardless of weather, time of day, or other variables that might affect a single delivery system. Lieutenant Commander Roger de Koven, a naval gunfire liaison officer during the Iwo Jima operation, described this integration. When weather prevented airstrikes, artillery and naval gunfire increased to compensate. When ships needed to replenish ammunition, artillery and airstrikes intensified. The Japanese never experienced a moment's respite. Someone was always delivering ordnance to their positions, 24 hours a day, without interruption. This integration reached its peak during the Okinawa campaign, where fire support coordination achieved a level of sophistication never before seen in warfare. General Simon Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, established a unified fire support command that controlled all artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. This command could shift thousands of tons of explosive power across the battlefield within minutes in response to tactical developments. By spring 1945, American artillery doctrine had completed its transformation. The pre-war emphasis on precision and conservation had been entirely replaced by what artillerymen called the mathematics of mass. Field manuals now contained calculations for area neutralization, determining how many shells of various types would be required to render a given area uninhabitable for specific periods. This approach reached its logical conclusion in planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, scheduled to begin in November 1945, included artillery preparations of unprecedented scale. The operation's Fire Support Annex called for over 30 million artillery shells to be delivered in the first 30 days, a rate of expenditure that would have been considered fantasy just 3 years earlier. The industrial mobilization supporting this plan was equally staggering. By July 1945, American factories were producing 8 million artillery shells per month. New production lines were still coming online, with planners projecting a peak capacity of 10 million shells monthly by early 1946. Shell manufacturing had become the second largest industrial enterprise in the United States, surpassed only by aircraft production. The human cost of this production miracle deserves equal recognition. By 1945, over 450,000 Americans, predominantly women, worked in ammunition plants. They faced daily hazards from explosive materials and toxic chemicals. The munitions industry recorded the highest accident rate of any war production sector. Yet it also maintained the highest worker retention rate, testament to the workforce's dedication to the war effort. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, massive stockpiles of artillery ammunition had accumulated at forward bases throughout the Pacific. These stocks, millions of shells that would never be fired in anger, represented both the success of the production miracle and the harsh mathematics of industrial warfare. America had essentially overwhelmed Japan's capacity to absorb punishment, creating an imbalance that made continued resistance futile. During the early occupation period, Japanese military officers toured American ammunition dumps under escort. General Toroshido Kawabe, who had served as vice chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, observed warehouses filled with artillery shells stretching beyond sight. After a long silence, he reportedly remarked, "Against such production, spirit alone was not enough. We believed that will could overcome material. We were wrong." This recognition extended to broader strategic insights. In December 1945, Emperor Hirohito received a final military assessment from a special imperial commission. The document, Unsealed Production System, creating detailed manuals and training films. These materials, classified until the 1970s, provided a blueprint for rapid industrial mobilization should another major conflict arise. The concept of maintaining this mobilization capacity became a cornerstone of Cold War defense planning. Some of the production innovations found immediate application in peacetime industries. The precision casting techniques developed for shell bodies transformed manufacturing processes for automotive and aircraft components. Quality control methods pioneered in ammunition plants became standard practice across American industry. The statistical process control theories refined during the war formed the foundation of the quality revolution that would later help American manufacturers compete globally. For the veterans who had experienced the effects of America's artillery dominance firsthand, the return to civilian life came with a unique perspective. Many former artillerymen entered manufacturing industries, bringing with them the lessons of industrial-scale logistics and operations. Thomas Hartman, who had commanded an artillery battalion on Okinawa, became a production manager at General Electric. "Artillery taught me how to move materials, maintain equipment, and manage complex operations under pressure," he explained in a 1957 interview. "These are universal skills in any large-scale enterprise." The technical innovations continued even after the war ended. Army researchers analyzing combat data from Pacific operations determined that proximity fuses, which detonated shells when they came within a preset distance of a target rather than on impact, had significantly increased artillery effectiveness. These fuses, initially in limited supply during the war, became standard components of post-war artillery ammunition. The proximity fuse itself represented another triumph of American mass production. Initially so complex and expensive that each fuse cost more than $100 to manufacture, equivalent to over $1,000 today, production innovations reduced the cost to less than $30 per unit by 1945. This 70% cost reduction made possible the widespread deployment of what had begun as a highly specialized technology, further multiplying the effectiveness of American artillery. The strategic implications of America's production capacity shaped global politics in the post-war era. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, receiving intelligence reports on American industrial performance, reportedly remarked to his generals in 1946, "The war has shown that American productive capacity is greater than we imagined. We must build our defenses with this reality in mind." This recognition influenced Soviet military doctrine and economic planning throughout the Cold War. For Japan, the lessons were even more profound. The experience of having been overwhelmed by American material abundance fundamentally reshaped Japanese national strategy. Post-war Japan abandoned militarism and instead channeled its energies into economic development. The economic miracle that transformed Japan into an industrial powerhouse during the 1950s and 1960s was in part inspired by what Japanese leaders had witnessed of American production during the war. Akio Morita, who founded Sony Corporation in 1946, had served as a naval officer during the war. He later wrote that experiencing American industrial might firsthand had convinced him that Japan's future lay in peaceful economic competition rather than military confrontation. "We had to learn to beat America at production, but this time the competition would be for markets, not territory."
Artillery revolution also influenced military thinking at the operational and tactical levels. The concept of suppressive fire, using sustained bombardment to limit enemy movement and reduce combat effectiveness, became a central element of American doctrine. This approach, born of ammunition abundance, shaped how American forces would fight in future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. Colonel David Henderson, who taught at the Army Command and General Staff College in the late 1940s, developed a theoretical framework for what he called psychological suppression. His research demonstrated that continuous artillery fire, even when not causing significant casualties, could reduce enemy unit effectiveness by up to 60% through sleep deprivation, stress, and disruption of command functions. This concept became a standard element of military education for generations of officers. The full impact of America's shell production advantage became apparent during the Korean War. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, they initially enjoyed significant artillery superiority. American units, operating with peacetime ammunition allocations, found themselves outgunned during the desperate defensive battles around the Pusan perimeter. The response was swift and decisive. Within 6 weeks, American munitions plants had returned to wartime production schedules. By September 1950, artillery units supporting the 8th Army were receiving ammunition allocations reminiscent of World War II levels. General Walton Walker, commanding American forces, leveraged this firepower advantage during the breakout from Pusan and subsequent pursuit of North Korean forces. The speed of this industrial response stunned military observers worldwide. Soviet advisors with the North Korean forces reported to Moscow that American artillery ammunition supplies had increased tenfold in less than 2 months, a mobilization rate they had believed impossible in peacetime. This demonstration of America's latent production capacity has strategic implications far beyond the Korean peninsula. After the Korean War, American defense planners formalized the concept of the industrial base as a critical strategic asset. The Defense Production Act of 1950, initially passed as an emergency measure, became a permanent framework for maintaining mobilization capacity. Specialized facilities for producing critical components, including artillery shells, were maintained in standby status, ready to resume full production with minimal delay. This approach represented a significant evolution in strategic thinking. Rather than maintaining vast wartime stockpiles, which would eventually become obsolete, the United States invested in preserving the capacity to produce modern equipment quickly when needed. The shell production system, with its proven track record of rapid scaling, became the model for this approach across the defense industrial base. The human stories behind the production miracle gradually faded from public memory in the decades following World War II. The women who would staff the production lines returned to other roles in American society. Their contributions, like those of many civilian war workers, received less recognition than the combat veterans whose lives they had helped save. Efforts to preserve this history emerged in the 1970s as women's historians began documenting the experiences of female defense workers. Rose Wilson, who had supervised shell casing production at the Elwood Ordnance Plant in 1975, participated in an oral history project at the University of Illinois in 1975. Her testimony captured both the danger and the determination that characterized work in munitions plants. "We knew every day that we might not come home," Wilson recalled. "The TNT would turn your skin yellow after a while. We called it the Canary Girls disease, but nobody quit because of it. We had brothers, husbands, and sons over there depending on what we made. Every shell meant one more chance for them to come home alive." The technical legacy of the shell production program continued evolving through subsequent conflicts. During the Vietnam War, American forces again deployed with virtually unlimited artillery support. The technique of harassment and interdiction fire, systematically shelling areas of suspected enemy activity, descended directly from the abundance doctrine developed in World War II. Fire-base operations in Vietnam represented the ultimate expression of artillery-centric warfare. These fortified positions, often established specifically to bring artillery to bear on infiltration routes, could deliver massive volumes of fire wherever needed within their range. The concept relied entirely on the assumption of unlimited ammunition resupply, a direct legacy of the production revolution. Colonel John Birdwell, an artillery officer who served multiple tours in Vietnam, noted the connection in a 1969 article for Field Artillery Journal. "What we're doing today along the DMZ has its roots in the Pacific campaigns of 1944-45. We've refined the techniques and improved the fire control, but the fundamental approach remains the same. Saturate the battlefield with firepower to a degree that the enemy cannot match or withstand."
The strategic significance of America's production advantage diminished somewhat during the later Cold War as the Soviet Union developed its own massive industrial capacity. Yet the psychological impact of knowing that American industry could outproduce any potential adversary remained a deterrent factor. Pentagon war games consistently identified industrial mobilization as a decisive advantage in any prolonged conventional conflict. When the Cold War ended, many of the specialized facilities maintained for emergency production were finally closed. The last dedicated artillery shell production line in the United States ceased operations in 1993. The knowledge, however, was preserved in technical manuals, engineering specifications, and educational programs at military industrial colleges. The true measure of the artillery production miracle lay not just in the statistics, though those remain impressive, but in the lives saved through its implementation. Every additional artillery shell fired represented one less risk that needed to be taken by American infantry. The ability to substitute firepower for manpower fundamentally altered the calculus of casualties throughout the Pacific campaigns. Marine Corps studies conducted after the war estimated that for every 100 additional tons of artillery shells expended on a given objective, American casualty rates decreased by approximately 15%. Applied across the entire Pacific theater, this correlation suggests that the shell production program likely prevented tens of thousands of American casualties during the island campaigns. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, who commanded Marine forces in several Pacific operations, put it more directly in his memoir. The shell production program back home saved more Marine lives than any other single factor in the war. When we had unlimited artillery support, we could reduce Japanese positions methodically without exposing our men to unnecessary risks. Every extra factory shift in Pittsburgh or Detroit meant fewer gold stars on mothers' windows back home. The connection between industrial output and battlefield survival created a powerful bond between home front and fighting front. Workers in ammunition plants received letters from soldiers on the front lines expressing gratitude for the ammunition supplied. Colonel Alfred Dow shared an example in his memoirs. "Dear worker, I'm an American soldier in Europe. The great bright shells are the gunner's dream."
Artillery units describing how their products were being used. Artillery crews, in turn, were shown films of production facilities and introduced to the industrial processes that supplied their guns. This mutual understanding helped sustain morale on both fronts during the most challenging periods of the war. Sarah Langford, who worked at the Kingsbury Ordnance Plant from 1942 to 1945, saved a letter she received from a Marine artillery battery on Peleliu. "The shells you ladies are making arrive in perfect condition," the battery commander had written. "Yesterday we fired over 2,000 rounds supporting an infantry assault on a ridge that had been giving us hell for 3 days. When our boys finally took it, they found over 200 dead Japanese who never had a chance to fight back because of your shells. You saved a lot of Marines yesterday. Keep them coming." For Japanese veterans, the memory of American artillery remained vivid decades after the war. Masashi Ito, who survived the Battle of Okinawa as a young officer, visited the United States in 1985 as part of a reconciliation program. When asked what had impressed him most about American forces, he replied without hesitation, "The artillery." It was not just the physical destruction, which was terrible enough. It was knowing that no matter how many shells they fired, there would always be more. It created a sense of hopelessness that was difficult to overcome. The production miracle represented more than just industrial output. It demonstrated a national commitment to supporting troops in combat with every resource available. This commitment became a fundamental element of the American approach to warfare. Future generations of American combat forces would operate with the expectation that they would never lack for ammunition, equipment, or supplies, an expectation born directly from the artillery revolution of World War II. During the 1991 Gulf War, Iraqi prisoners expressed the same astonishment at American firepower that Japanese troops had voiced nearly 50 years earlier. One captured Iraqi officer told his interrogators, "We expected your air power, but not the artillery. It never stopped day or night. How can you afford to expend so many shells against positions that might not even contain our forces?"
The answer, of course, lay in the industrial and organizational foundations established during World War II. Though the specific production facilities had long since been repurposed, the underlying approach remained. Overwhelming firepower delivered continuously to minimize American casualties, regardless of resource expenditure. This approach, often criticized as wasteful or excessive by foreign military observers, reflected a fundamental American value, the belief that material resources should be expended freely to preserve human lives. The willingness to waste ammunition on suppressive fire or speculative targets stemmed from the national priority of bringing American troops home alive whenever possible. The ultimate legacy of America's artillery revolution extends beyond military applications. It demonstrated how organizational innovation, when properly applied to production challenges, could achieve results that seemed mathematically impossible. The methods developed for shell production, standardization, quality control, process optimization, and workforce training became standard practices across American industry in the post-war period. Peter Drucker, the influential management theorist, studied the munitions industry extensively after the war. In his 1946 book, Concept of the Corporation, he identified the shell production program
as a case study in effective, large-scale manufacturing organization. Drucker noted that the program had succeeded not through revolutionary technology, but through systematic application of known principles at unprecedented scale, an approach he advocated for peacetime industries. The social impact of the munitions workforce experience proved equally significant. Millions of American women who might never have considered industrial employment discovered capabilities and opportunities during their wartime service. While many returned to traditional roles after the war, the experience permanently altered perceptions about women's capabilities in technical and manufacturing fields. Margaret Chase, who rose from assembly line worker to production supervisor at the St. Louis Ordnance Plant, later reflected, "Before the war, I'd never held a tool more complicated than a kitchen mixer. By 1945, I was supervising a technical operation with 200 workers and meeting production quotas that determined battle outcomes halfway around the world. That changes how you see yourself forever." Perhaps the most profound aspect of America's production advantage was its foundation in ordinary citizens performing extraordinary work. The shell production miracle wasn't achieved by scientific geniuses or military strategists alone, but by millions of regular Americans, factory workers, engineers, managers, and logisticians, each contributing their part to an enterprise of unprecedented scale. This democratic dimension distinguished American industrial mobilization from that of other powers. The German war economy relied heavily on forced labor and authoritarian control. Japan's production system was constrained by rigid hierarchies and limited resources. The Soviet Union achieved remarkable production results, but at tremendous human cost through coercion and deprivation. America's approach, by contrast, leveraged the voluntary contributions of a free citizenry, motivated by patriotism and fairly compensated for their efforts. This system proved not just more humane, but ultimately more effective, producing higher quality at greater volume than any of its contemporaries. William Knudsen, who served as Director of Production in the Office of War Production Management, captured this distinction in a 1943 speech to munitions workers. "What makes our production truly remarkable is not just its scale, but its source. Every shell, every tank, every aircraft represents the free choice of American citizens to contribute their labor to victory. That is a resource no dictator can match, no matter how many slave laborers they command." The artillery production miracle exemplified American pragmatism at its best, recognizing a problem, applying systematic solutions, and committing resources decisively once the path forward became clear. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly organized and directed, could reshape battlefield realities and strategic outcomes more fundamentally than any tactical innovation. For today's military leaders and industrial planners, the lessons of this transformation remain relevant. The ability to rapidly scale production of critical systems in response to emerging threats continues to be a cornerstone of national security. The organizational methods developed for shell production have evolved, but not fundamentally changed. The principles of standardization, quality control, and process optimization transcend specific technologies. Most importantly, the shell production miracle reminds us that seemingly insurmountable challenges can be overcome through systematic effort and national commitment. When Dr. William Schuyler first proposed his production revolution in 1942, critics dismissed it as mathematically impossible. Existing techniques and facilities simply could not produce the volumes he envisioned. Yet within 18 months, American factories were exceeding.
For the Japanese soldiers who faced the consequences of this production miracle, the experience reshaped their understanding of warfare and national power. Their testimony, recorded in interrogations and memoirs, consistently expresses a kind of wonder at America's material abundance, not just the quantity of shells, but the willingness to expend them without apparent limitation. This wonder gradually transformed into respect and eventually partnership as former enemies became allies. The same industrial capacity that had overwhelmed Japan in war helped rebuild it in peace. Many of the manufacturing techniques developed for wartime production found application in Japan's post-war industrial resurgence, creating an unexpected legacy of technical exchange. Today, artillery shell production may seem an artifact of a different era of warfare. Modern precision munitions have replaced mass bombardment in many scenarios, and digital technologies have transformed both manufacturing and battlefield tactics. Yet the fundamental insight of the shell production program remains valid. Industrial capacity, when efficiently organized and decisively applied, can alter the dynamics of conflict in ways that no adversary can counter. The greatest tribute to this achievement lies in the lives it saved on both sides. Every Japanese position reduced by artillery rather than infantry assault meant American soldiers who returned home instead of dying on foreign beaches. And as the war's end approached, the demonstrated futility of resistance against such overwhelming material superiority helped convince Japanese leaders that continued fighting would bring only useless suffering to their people. The artillery revolution reminds us that victory in modern conflict depends not just on the courage and skill of those in uniform, but on the collective effort of an entire society. The shells that rained down on enemy positions in the Pacific were the physical embodiment of American industrial might, organizational skill, and national determination, a mathematics of production that ultimately proved more decisive than any battlefield tactic or strategy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.